Under the dim orange glow of the streetlights, the suburban park lay quiet, its empty paths winding between tall oak trees and well-manicured grass. The evening air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of wet earth after a recent drizzle. This peaceful scene was interrupted only by the rhythmic sound of footsteps on gravel. A woman in her late 20s jogged at a steady pace, her breathing controlled, her movements fluid and practiced. Her name was Alice Johnson, and this evening routine was more than just exercise for her. It was a way to clear her mind after long, stressful days working as a community advocate. Tall and athletic, with sharp features and a confident presence, she had the aura of someone who didn't back down easily, someone used to navigating life's challenges head-on. Dressed in a simple black tracksuit, with reflective stripes and wearing a pair of running shoes that had clearly seen countless miles, Alice exuded discipline and composure. She had grown up in a strict household, where resilience wasn't just taught, it was expected. As she rounded a bend in the path, her eyes caught sight of a group of teenagers huddled by a bench. They were laughing loudly, some kicking at the gravel beneath their feet, while others took turns scrolling through their phones. Alice glanced at them briefly but didn't pay much attention. This was a neighborhood she knew well, a place where families came to walk their dogs and children played on weekends. It wasn't unusual to see kids hanging around after dark. Yet, despite the familiarity, she never fully let her guard down. Years of working in marginalized communities and advocating for people who had suffered various forms of injustice had taught her to stay aware of her surroundings at all times. As she continued her run, Alice felt the comforting presence of her loyal Labrador retriever, Bastion, trotting a few steps behind her. Bastion was a large dog with a sleek black coat, muscular but gentle in demeanor. He had been her companion for years, and in many ways he was more than just a pet. He was a silent protector, always keeping close watch over her. Tonight, like most nights, Bastion followed her without a leash, well-trained and obedient, responding to her every gesture. They reached a quieter part of the park, where the trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the streetlight. The shadows danced across the ground as the wind rustled the leaves above. Alice slowed her pace slightly, taking a deep breath of the cool night air. She enjoyed this part of her run the most, the solitude, the quiet, the feeling of being alone with her thoughts. But that sense of calm was shattered when she noticed the headlights of a car creeping slowly along the nearby road that ran parallel to the park. At first, she thought little of it. Cars often passed by here on their way to the residential streets beyond. But something about this particular vehicle felt off. It moved too slowly, as if the driver was watching something or someone. Her instincts, honed from years of working in tense environments, kicked in. She glanced over her shoulder, catching a glimpse of the patrol car's unmistakable black and white exterior and flashing roof lights. The car continued its slow crawl until it came to a stop just ahead of her, near the entrance to a smaller path that branched off into the park. The door of the patrol car swung open, and out stepped Officer Douglas Harper. Mid-40s, stocky build, with a permanent scowl etched onto his face, Harper was a long-time member of the local police force. He had a reputation in the community, and not a good one. Known for his abrasive attitude and aggressive policing style, he was the kind of officer who seemed to thrive on confrontation. Harper's uniform was neatly pressed, his badge gleaming under the streetlights, but there was something in his posture, in the way he carried himself, that made it clear he wasn't here for a friendly chat. Evening, Harper called out, his voice gruff and devoid of any warmth. He took a few steps forward, his hand resting casually on his belt, near the holster of his sidearm. "Out kinda late, aren't we?" Alice stopped running, turning to face him with a calm yet guarded expression. She had dealt with officers like Harper before, men who used their authority as a weapon, who saw people like her as problems to be dealt with rather than citizens to be protected. She knew better than to show any sign of fear or defiance. Keeping her voice steady, she replied, "Just out for a run. I come here most evenings." Harper's eyes flicked down to Bastian, who stood by Alice's side, his ears perked up, sensing the tension in the air. "No leash," Harper said, raising an eyebrow. "You know that's against park regulations, right?" Alice resisted the urge to sigh. She knew the park rules well, and there was no regulation requiring dogs to be leashed unless they were behaving aggressively. Bastian, as always, was calm and perfectly under control. "There's no leash requirement in this part of the park," she replied evenly. "Bastian's well trained. He's never caused any trouble." Harper took another step closer, his expression hardening. "Still, it's late, and you're out here alone." Looks suspicious. His tone was laced with accusation, as if simply being in the park at this hour was a crime. "Mind if I ask for some ID?" There it was, the moment she had anticipated from the second he stepped out of his car. The demand for identification, the implied assumption that she didn't belong here, that she needed to justify her presence in a public space. Alice had seen this play out before, countless times, with friends, with colleagues, with strangers who had shared their stories with her. But experiencing it herself never made it easier. "Is there a reason you're stopping me, officer?" she asked, keeping her tone polite but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong." Harper's jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He wasn't used to people questioning him, especially not in this neighborhood, where most residents knew better than to provoke him. "Look, I don't want any trouble," he said, though his body language suggested otherwise. "Just show me your ID, and we'll be done here." Alice weighed her options. She could comply, hand over her ID, and hope he would let her go without further incident. But something in her gut told her that wouldn't be the end of it. Harper didn't strike her as the type to back down once he had decided to assert his authority. And then there was Bastian. She didn't trust Harper not to use the dog as an excuse to escalate the situation. Before she could respond, Harper's hand moved to his radio, and he spoke into it. "Unit 12, requesting backup at Oak Ridge Park. Possible suspicious individual refusing to cooperate." Alice's heart rate quickened, not from fear, but from the realization that this situation was about to get a lot more complicated. She had to think fast. Under the dimming light of the park's lamps, the tension between Alice and Officer Harper was palpable, like a taut wire ready to snap. Bastian, sensing the escalating hostility, let out a low, almost imperceptible growl, a warning, not an outright threat, but enough to catch Harper's attention. His hand, still resting near his belt, twitched slightly, and Alice noticed the way his fingers brushed against the handle of his baton. Harper's face was set, his eyes sharp and scrutinizing, as if he were waiting for any reason, however small, to take control of the situation by force. Alice, standing motionless yet perfectly composed, maintained eye contact with him. She knew from experience that officers like Harper thrived on fear and submission. Any sign of nervousness, any hesitation, would be interpreted as guilt. But she wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. Still, the presence of a growing unease in her mind was undeniable. The way Harper's gaze kept shifting between her and Bastian, the way his posture seemed to become more rigid with each passing second, it all pointed to one thing: he was looking for an excuse. "I don't see why you needed backup," Alice said calmly, though there was a hard edge to her voice. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm just running in a public park like anyone else." Harper didn't immediately respond. Instead, he reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder and repeated his earlier transmission, this time with an added urgency. "Unit 12 requesting immediate assistance." Individual refusing to comply, possible threat. The word threat echoed in Alice's mind, and her jaw clenched involuntarily. It was the kind of language designed to escalate a situation, to paint a picture where none existed. She knew what came next: officers arriving on the scene, possibly armed, viewing her as a potential danger before even assessing the situation. It was a familiar script, one she had heard countless times in her line of work, but living through it was a different story altogether. Bastian took a step closer to Alice, his body language protective. Harper noticed and immediately pointed at the dog, his expression hardening further. "Control your dog," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "If he makes one wrong move, I'll put him down." Alice's heart skipped a beat, not from fear for herself but for Bastian. She knew Harper's type: trigger-happy, eager to assert dominance, always ready to use force under the guise of maintaining order. She also knew that one wrong word from her could escalate things further, turning a tense encounter into something far worse. Keeping her voice as steady as she could, she said, "Bastian is under control. He's not a threat to you or anyone else." Harper's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, Alice thought he might actually listen, that he might back off and let her go. But then his expression shifted, his lips curling into a sneer. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and Alice instinctively tightened her grip on Bastian's collar. "Turn around," Harper ordered sharply. "Hands behind your back." Alice didn't move. "On what grounds?" she asked, her tone measured but firm. "You have no reason to detain me. I haven't committed any crime." Refusal to cooperate, Harper shot back, his hand now fully gripping the baton at his side. "You're resisting a lawful order from a police officer. That's grounds enough." Alice knew that legally, Harper was on shaky ground. He had no probable cause, no justification for detaining her beyond his own prejudices. But knowing that didn't change the immediate reality of the situation. Harper was armed, aggressive, and clearly determined to assert his authority. Any attempt to reason with him would likely fall on deaf ears. "I'm not resisting," Alice said carefully. "I'm just asking for an explanation." Harper's patience, thin to begin with, had clearly worn out. Without another word, he reached for Alice's wrist, grabbing it with a force that made her wince. Bastian barked sharply, stepping forward as if to defend her, but Alice quickly commanded him to stay. The dog hesitated, his muscles tensed, but he obeyed, remaining by her side. Harper yanked Alice's arm behind her back, twisting it at an uncomfortable angle. "You want to play games?" he growled. "Fine. Let's see how cooperative you are when you're in cuffs." Alice didn't resist. She knew better than to give him any excuse to escalate things further. But that didn't make the experience any less humiliating. As Harper pulled out a pair of handcuffs and snapped them onto her wrists, she felt a surge of anger rising within her, a deep, burning resentment at being treated like a criminal for simply existing in a public space. "Now," Harper said, his tone triumphant, "we're going to take a little walk over to my car. You can explain yourself down at the station." "You're making a mistake," Alice said through gritted teeth. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will." Harper ignored her, pulling her roughly by the arm as he led her toward his patrol car. Bastian followed closely, his eyes never leaving Harper. The dog's presence seemed to unnerve the officer, who kept casting wary glances in its direction. As they approached the patrol car, the sound of another vehicle approaching reached Alice's ears. She turned her head slightly and saw a black SUV pulling up to the curb. The vehicle came to a stop and the driver's side door opened. Out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man with a calm but commanding presence, her brother, Michael. Michael Johnson was a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. His mere presence was enough. dressed in plain clothes, with a tactical backpack slung over one shoulder. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far greater threats than a local cop with an attitude problem. His eyes locked onto Alice, taking in the sight of her cuffed hands and the tense posture of Harper. Without saying a word, Michael began walking toward them, his expression unreadable. Harper noticed the approaching figure and instinctively tightened his grip on Alice's arm. "Stay back," he barked, his voice betraying a hint of unease. "This is police business." Michael didn't stop. He continued his steady approach, his eyes never leaving Harper. "That's my sister," he said quietly, but there was an unmistakable edge to his tone. "Let her go." Harper hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Michael's calm but authoritative demeanor. He glanced around, as if expecting someone to back him up, but there was no one else. The backup he had called for hadn't yet arrived. "I said, stay back," Harper repeated, his voice growing louder, more defensive. "She's under arrest." "For what?" Michael asked, stopping a few feet away. His tone was even, but there was a coldness in his eyes that made it clear he wasn't asking out of curiosity. "What crime did she commit?" Harper opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked flustered, as if realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he had no real answer. Michael took a step closer, his gaze hard and unyielding. "You've got two options," Michael said quietly. "Either you let her go right now, or we have a much bigger problem on our hands." For a moment, it seemed as though Harper might actually back down. But then, as if out of sheer stubbornness, he pulled Alice closer and reached for his radio. "I'm not taking orders from you," he snapped. "You're interfering with an arrest." Michael's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a readiness, a coiled tension that hinted at the possibility of violence. Alice, watching the exchange, knew that things were about to reach a breaking point. She also knew that Michael was more than capable of handling himself in a fight. Years of training as a Navy SEAL had made him a formidable opponent, and he wasn't someone who took kindly to threats against his family. "Last chance," Michael said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let her go." The tension in the air was thick, palpable, like the calm before a violent storm. Alice could feel Harper's grip tighten around her arm, his knuckles whitening as if clinging to some last shred of control over the situation. Her wrists ached from the cold steel of the handcuffs, but she held her composure, knowing that any sign of fear or pain would only embolden the officer further. She glanced sideways at her brother Michael, who stood a few feet away, his gaze locked onto Harper with the intensity of a predator evaluating its prey. Michael was not a man prone to rash actions. Years of service as a Navy SEAL had taught him the value of patience, observation, and precision. He knew that Harper was on edge, that the officer was trying to maintain dominance over the encounter. But he also knew something else. Harper had made a critical mistake. He had allowed emotion and prejudice to cloud his judgment, and now he was standing on a razor's edge, dangerously close to losing control of the situation entirely. "You think this is a game?" Harper snapped, his voice rising in pitch as his eyes darted between Alice and Michael. "I said back off. You're interfering with a lawful arrest." Michael's expression remained calm, but there was a cold fire in his eyes that made Harper hesitate for a split second. "There's nothing lawful about what you're doing," Michael said evenly, his tone devoid of emotion yet carrying an undeniable weight. "Uncuff her, and we can walk away from this right now. No one gets hurt." Harper let out a short, derisive laugh, though it sounded more forced than genuine. "Hurt? Is that a threat?" He shifted slightly, his stance becoming more defensive. His free hand moved closer to the baton hanging from his belt. "I'm not about to take orders from some thug pretending to be a hero." Alice tensed at the word. She knew exactly what Harper was doing, trying to provoke Michael, trying to bait him into making a move that would justify the use of force. But Michael didn't take the bait. Instead, he took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them by half. His hands were still at his sides, relaxed but ready, and his voice remained calm. "No threats," Michael said softly. "Just facts. You're out of your depth here, officer. You've already crossed a line, and if you keep pushing, things will escalate fast. You don't want that." Harper's face flushed red, whether from anger or embarrassment. It was hard to tell. He opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, the sound of tires crunching against gravel drew everyone's attention. A second patrol car pulled up, its headlights casting long shadows across the park. Two more officers stepped out, their hands resting on their belts, eyes scanning the scene with a mix of curiosity and caution. Harper seemed to gain a surge of confidence from the arrival of backup. He straightened his posture, his grip on Alice loosening slightly as he turned to address the newcomers. "Glad you could make it," he called out, his voice regaining some of its earlier authority. "This one's resisting arrest. And this guy here," he jabbed a thumb in Michael's direction, "is interfering." The two officers, a younger man and a woman in her early 40s, exchanged a quick glance before approaching cautiously. The older officer, whose name tag read Lieutenant R. Martinez, stepped forward first. Her eyes moved from Alice to Michael, then back to Harper, taking in the scene with a practiced detachment. "Harper," Martinez said slowly, her tone measured. "What exactly is going on here?" "I already told you," Harper replied impatiently. She was acting suspicious, wouldn't comply when I asked for ID, and now her friend here thinks he can tell me how to do my job. Martinez's gaze lingered on Alice's cuffed wrists, then shifted to Michael, who met her eyes without flinching. There was something in his stance, something about the way he carried himself, that made her pause. This wasn't just some random guy getting involved in a police matter. There was a story here, and she could tell it was one she didn't fully understand yet. "Sir," she said, addressing Michael directly, "I'm going to need you to step back for a moment while we sort this out." Michael didn't move. "I'm not stepping anywhere until you uncuff my sister," he said, his voice low and steady. "She hasn't committed any crime. This officer," he nodded toward Harper, "is out of line, and you know it." Martinez's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't react aggressively. Instead, she turned to Harper, her expression growing more serious. "Harper, did she resist you physically? Did she make any threats?" Harper hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "No, but she was being uncooperative." "Uncooperative isn't the same as resisting," Martinez interrupted, her tone sharp. "You cuffed someone in a public park without probable cause. That's a problem." Harper's face twisted in frustration. "Are you seriously taking their side? You weren't here, you didn't see how she was acting." "I see how she's acting now," Martinez shot back, her patience clearly wearing thin. "She's standing there calmly, in cuffs, with no indication that she's a threat. And I see him," she gestured to Michael, who, by the way, looks like he knows exactly what he's doing and isn't about to cause trouble unless you give him a reason. Alice, watching the exchange, felt a glimmer of hope. Martinez seemed reasonable, someone who might actually diffuse the situation instead of escalating it further. But Harper wasn't ready to back down. He squared his shoulders, his hand finally moving to the baton at his side. "You don't understand," Harper said through gritted teeth. "These people, that's enough," Martinez snapped, cutting him off. "Step back. Now." For a moment, it looked like Harper might refuse. His eyes darted to the younger officer, as if seeking support, but the younger man simply shifted uncomfortably, clearly unwilling to get involved. Realizing he was alone, Harper reluctantly let go of Alice's arm and took a step back, though his expression remained defiant. Martinez turned to Alice. "Ma'am, I'm going to remove the cuffs. Are you willing to cooperate while we figure this out?" Alice nodded, her voice steady despite the lingering tension. "I've been cooperating from the start." Martinez gave a curt nod, then pulled a key from her belt and unlocked the handcuffs. Alice rubbed her wrists, feeling the sting of raw skin where the metal had bitten into her flesh. Bastian, sensing that things were finally calming down, relaxed slightly, his tail wagging once as he stepped closer to Alice. Michael remained where he was, watching silently as Martinez continued to de-escalate the situation. He knew better than to let his guard down completely. Situations like these could turn on a dime. But for now it seemed that reason was prevailing. Martinez glanced at Michael, a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "You military?" she asked. "Retired," Michael replied simply. She nodded, as if that explained everything. "Well, thank you for keeping things calm. Let's make sure it stays that way." Harper, still fuming, opened his mouth as if to argue, but Martinez shot him a warning look that silenced him instantly. Turning back to Alice and Michael, she said, "You're free to go. Sorry for the trouble." Alice didn't respond right away. She glanced at Michael, who gave a slight nod, then turned back to Martinez. "Thank you," she said quietly. Without another word, she and Michael began walking away, Bastian trotting at their side. As they disappeared into the shadows of the park, Harper stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. In his mind, they had humiliated him, undermined his authority. He wasn't about to let that go. "I'll be filing a report," Harper muttered under his breath. Martinez didn't even look at him. "Do what you have to do, Harper. Just make sure it's the truth." Harper said nothing more, but the look in his eyes promised one thing: this wasn't the end. Under the blanket of night, Alice and Michael walked side by side, their strides purposeful and quiet as they exited the park. Bastian kept close to Alice, his ears twitching at every faint rustle in the bushes. The cool evening air seemed heavier now, weighed down by the events that had just unfolded. Alice could still feel the residual sting on her wrists where the handcuffs had dug into her skin. Her thoughts churned as she replayed the encounter with Harper, each moment feeding a growing sense of outrage. "I can't believe he did that," Alice said, her voice low but simmering with anger. "He had no reason. None." Michael glanced at her, his sharp eyes scanning the empty street ahead. His own emotions were carefully hidden behind a stoic expression, but Alice knew him well enough to see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands flexed and relaxed as if preparing for another confrontation. "This isn't the first time, and it won't be the last," he said quietly. "Guys like him, they think the badge gives them power over everything. But he made a mistake tonight." Alice nodded, her breath still uneven. "He's not going to let this go, is he?" "No," Michael replied, his tone resolute. "But neither are we." As they reached the edge of the park, the faint sound of distant sirens drifted through the air. It wasn't clear if they were heading toward the scene they had just left, but it didn't matter. Michael had already decided their next move. He pulled his phone from his pocket and quickly dialed a number, his voice calm and precise when the line connected. "Alex, it's me," he said. "We've got a situation. Meet us at the usual place in 20. Alice watched him, her brows furrowing slightly. "Who's Alex?" she asked as he ended the call. "Someone who can help," Michael replied, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "We need to get ahead of this before Harper spins his version of the story." Alice didn't press further. She trusted Michael's judgment, especially in situations like this. His military training had instilled in him a strategic mindset, one that prioritized staying a step ahead of potential threats. If he believed this Alex person could help, then she was willing to follow his lead. They continued walking in silence, the streets eerily quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Alice felt a surge of gratitude for her brother's presence. Even in the most chaotic moments, Michael had a way of grounding her, of making her feel like they could face anything together. But beneath that gratitude lay a simmering frustration at a system that allowed men like Harper to wield power unchecked, frustration at the realization that no amount of compliance or calm reasoning could prevent situations like this from happening. When they reached the meeting point, a dimly lit diner tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, Alice immediately noticed the lone figure sitting at one of the outdoor tables. The man looked to be in his late 30s, with a lean, wiry build and sharp features that gave him an air of quiet intensity. He was dressed casually in dark jeans and a plain grey hoodie, but there was something about the way he carried himself that reminded Alice of Michael, calm, confident, and always alert. Alex, Michael said as they approached. The man looked up, his piercing green eyes narrowing slightly as he took in Michael, and then Alice. He nodded once in acknowledgement. Michael, he said, his voice low and gravelly. Who's this? My sister, Michael replied. Alice, meet Alex Parker. We served together. Alice extended a hand, and Alex shook it briefly, his grip firm but not overbearing. Nice to meet you, she said, though her tone carried a hint of skepticism. She wasn't sure what kind of help Michael expected from this man, but she was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. Let's sit, Alex said, gesturing to the table. Tell me what happened. They settled into their seats, and Michael recounted the events of the evening with precision, leaving out no detail. Alex listened intently, his expression unreadable, occasionally nodding as Michael spoke. When the story was finished, Alex leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. Harper, he said thoughtfully. I've heard of him. Bad reputation, but somehow always manages to stay out of trouble. Protected by someone higher up, most likely. Alice's stomach churned at the thought. So what do we do, she asked. If he's protected, how do we hold him accountable? Alex's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. We make his protection irrelevant, he said. We expose him in a way that can't be ignored, even by those covering for him. And how do we do that, Michael asked, his tone sharp. Alex leaned forward, his green eyes glinting in the dim light. First, we gather evidence. Real evidence, witnesses, video, anything that proves his misconduct. Then we leverage it in the right way. Not through the media, not through protests. We take it straight to internal affairs and make it impossible for them to sweep it under the rug. Alice frowned, her skepticism returning. You make it sound easy. But what if they still try to cover for him? Then we push harder, Alex said simply. There's always a weak link. We find it, and we break it. Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. What do you need from us? Alex looked between them, his gaze lingering on Alice. I need her statement, first and foremost. Then we start tracking down witnesses. Anyone who saw what happened tonight could be crucial. Alice hesitated, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had spent years fighting for others, but now she found herself in the center of the battle, her own experience a key piece of the puzzle. The thought was both daunting and infuriating, but she knew there was no other choice. Fine, she said, her voice firm. Let's do it. Over the next hour, they worked together to piece together a plan. Alex had connections in places Alice didn't even want to think about, people who could help track down footage from nearby security cameras, people who could quietly gather information about Harper's past conduct. As they strategized, Alice began to feel a sense of determination replacing her earlier frustration. This wasn't just about her, it was about standing up to a system that had failed too many for too long. By the time they left the diner, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Michael walked beside her, his presence as steady and reassuring as ever. Bastian trotted ahead, his tail wagging slightly, as if sensing the shift in their mood. "We'll get through this," Michael said quietly, breaking the silence. Alice glanced at him, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "We always do," she replied. But even as she spoke the words, a nagging thought lingered in the back of her mind. Harper wasn't the type to back down easily, and she knew this fight was far from over. What she didn't know was just how far Harper was willing to go and how dangerous the road ahead would become. Under the growing light of early morning, the streets were still mostly empty, but there was an underlying tension that neither Alice nor Michael could ignore. They had left the diner with a clear plan, thanks to Alex's help, but a sense of unease lingered in the air. It wasn't just about Harper anymore, this had become something larger, something dangerous. Michael had been in enough tense situations to know when trouble was brewing, and he could feel it now, a gut-level instinct that told him Harper wouldn't let this slide. As they walked down a quiet street toward the parking lot where Michael's car was parked, Alice glanced at her brother, noting the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, ever vigilant. Bastian trotted along beside them, his leash loose in Alice's hand, but even the dog seemed more alert than usual, ears perked and nose twitching at every slight noise. "You think he'll try something?" Alice asked, breaking the silence. Michael didn't answer right away. Instead, he paused for a moment, listening to the distant hum of a car engine that seemed to be getting closer. "I don't think Harper is the kind of guy who takes humiliation lightly," he said finally. "He's probably already spinning his version of what happened, and if he has people protecting him, they're going to want to shut us down before we can do anything." Alice frowned, her grip tightening on Bastian's leash. "Shut us down how?" Michael's jaw clenched slightly. "Could be anything. Intimidation, threats, worse." Alice stopped walking, forcing Michael to do the same. "Worse? You mean violence?" Michael turned to face her, his expression serious. "Guys like Harper don't play fair. If he feels cornered, he'll lash out. And if the people covering for him think we're a real threat, they won't hesitate to take drastic measures." For a moment, Alice felt a flicker of fear, but she quickly pushed it aside. She had faced intimidation before, had dealt with people who thought they could scare her into silence. This was different, yes, but she wasn't about to back down. "So what do we do?" she asked. "Just wait for them to come after us?" "No," Michael said firmly. "We stay ahead of them. We keep moving, we gather evidence, and we don't give them a chance to corner us." Before Alice could respond, the sound of the car engine grew louder, and moments later, a dark sedan turned the corner and started heading toward them. Michael's eyes narrowed, and he instinctively stepped in front of Alice, positioning himself between her and the approaching vehicle. Bastian let out a low growl, his body tense. The sedan slowed as it neared them, its windows tinted so dark that it was impossible to see who was inside. It came to a stop a few yards away, idling in the middle of the road. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then, the driver's side window rolled down just enough to reveal a familiar face: Harper. "Well, well," Harper said, his voice dripping with false casualness. "Out for an early morning stroll? Thought you'd be home licking your wounds after last night." Michael didn't move, his posture calm but ready. "You following us, Harper?" he asked, his tone flat and unamused. Harper chuckled, though there was no real humor in the sound. Just keeping an eye on things. Making sure the neighborhood stays safe. Alice stepped forward, despite Michael's attempt to keep her behind him. Her eyes locked onto Harper's, and her voice was steady as she said, "You're not here to keep anything safe. You're here because you don't like that we stood up to you." Harper's expression darkened slightly, the smirk fading from his lips. "Careful, sweetheart," he said, his tone laced with menace. "You don't want to make enemies in the wrong places." Michael took a step closer to the car, his movements slow and deliberate. "Is that a threat, Harper?" Harper leaned forward slightly, resting his elbow on the window frame. "Just some friendly advice," he said. "You see, people like me, we have friends. Friends who don't take kindly to outsiders causing trouble." Michael's eyes didn't waver. "And people like me don't take kindly to bullies hiding behind a badge. So here's some advice for you: walk away while you still can." For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the tension between them crackling like a live wire. Harper's hand twitched slightly, as if considering reaching for something, but then he seemed to think better of it. With a forced smile, he leaned back and rolled up the window. The sedan remained idling for a few more seconds before finally pulling away, disappearing around the corner. Michael watched it go, his expression unreadable, but Alice could see the tightness in his shoulders, the way his fists clenched and unclenched at his sides. "This isn't over," Alice said quietly. "No," Michael agreed. "It's just getting started." They continued to the parking lot in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they reached Michael's car, he unlocked it and opened the passenger door for Alice. Bastian hopped into the back seat, settling down but keeping his eyes on the window. As Michael started the engine, he glanced over at Alice. "We need to stay sharp. Harper's not going to stop with idle threats. He'll escalate, and we need to be ready." Alice nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "You think he'll come after us again today?" "Maybe not directly," Michael said. "But he'll try to find a way to pressure us. Maybe through someone we know, or by trying to discredit us." They drove in silence for a while, the city slowly coming to life around them. The morning light cast long shadows across the streets, and the air was filled with the distant sounds of traffic and early risers starting their day. Despite the outward calm, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that Harper or someone working with him was waiting for the right moment to strike. When they reached Alex's office, a nondescript building in a quiet part of town, Michael parked the car and turned to Alice. "Let's get inside. We need to figure out our next move." Inside, Alex was already waiting for them, seated behind a cluttered desk filled with papers, laptops, and various gadgets that Alice couldn't even begin to identify. He looked up as they entered, his expression serious. "Harper," he asked. "Oh." "Followed us," Michael said. "Made some thinly veiled threats, tried to intimidate us." Alex nodded, as if he had expected as much. "That's his style. He'll keep pushing, trying to get a reaction. If we push back too hard, he'll escalate. If we don't push back at all, he'll see it as a weakness." "So what do we do?" Alice asked, her frustration evident. Alex leaned forward, steepling his fingers under his chin. "We stay smart. We keep gathering evidence, but we don't let him control the narrative. We make sure every move we make is calculated, deliberate, and we don't let him bait us into doing something reckless." Michael crossed his arms, his expression thoughtful. "What about his backup? He mentioned having friends." Alex's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "He does. And that's where things get tricky. If he has people protecting him from above, they'll try to shut us down before we can expose anything. But if we play this right, we can turn some of those friends against him." "How?" Alice asked, skeptical. By finding the weak link, Alex said simply. Everyone has one. We just need to figure out who and what leverage we can use. Alice exchanged a glance with Michael, a silent understanding passing between them. This wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. But they weren't about to back down, not now, not ever. "We're in," Alice said firmly. "What's the next step?" Alex's eyes gleamed with determination. "The next step is simple. We make Harper regret ever coming after you." The tension inside Alex's office was thick, a palpable heaviness that seemed to settle over the room as they finalized their plan. Every move they made from this point forward would be critical. One wrong step, and Harper could either escalate further or find a way to discredit them entirely. Michael leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes locked on Alex, who was typing furiously on a laptop. Alice sat beside Bastian, the dog resting his head on her lap, sensing her unease. "All right," Alex said, breaking the silence, his eyes fixed on the screen. "I've tapped into the city's public security camera network. We might be able to get footage from the park last night, but it's going to take some time to sift through." Michael nodded. "That's a start. What about Harper's connections? You said he has friends in high places. Any idea who they are?" Alex's fingers paused for a moment, hovering over the keyboard. "I've been digging into his history. Harper's been on the force for over 15 years. He's had multiple complaints filed against him: excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation tactics. But none of those complaints ever went anywhere. Each one was either dismissed or quietly settled." "Which means someone's covering for him," Alice said, her voice edged with frustration. "Someone with enough influence to keep him protected." "Exactly," Alex agreed. "And from what I've found, it looks like he's got ties to a Deputy Chief Paul Renner. Renner's known for being, let's just say, sympathetic to officers like Harper. He's been in the department for decades and has built a network of loyalists who look the other way when things get messy." Michael's expression hardened. "So if we go after Harper, we're not just dealing with him, we're dealing with Renner and whoever else he has backing him up." "That's why we have to be smart about this," Alex said. "If we try to expose Harper without solid evidence, they'll bury us. But if we can get something concrete, something they can't ignore or cover up, then we force their hand." "And what happens if Harper gets to us first?" Alice asked, her voice steady but laced with tension. Alex looked at her, his expression serious. "That's a risk. He's already tried intimidation. If that doesn't work, he might escalate to something more direct. But that's why we're not going to give him the chance. We stay ahead of him, keep gathering evidence, and stay in the open. If we disappear or go quiet, it gives him the upper hand." Michael pushed off the wall, his posture tense. "Then we don't have time to waste. What's next?" Alex turned the laptop around, showing them a grainy black and white image paused on the screen. "This is from a traffic camera near the park. It caught Harper's patrol car arriving and leaving the scene. If we can get access to the full footage, we might be able to see everything that happened, including when he cuffed Alice." "Can you get it?" Alice asked, leaning forward. "I can try," Alex said. "But accessing traffic cam footage without a warrant isn't exactly legal. I'll need to work fast and cover my tracks." "Do it," Michael said without hesitation. "We'll keep watch. If Harper or anyone else shows up, we'll deal with them." Alex nodded, already turning back to his work. The room fell silent again, the only sound the rapid tapping of keys as Alex navigated through various encrypted systems. Alice tried to steady her breathing, but the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come pressed heavily on her chest. She glanced at Michael, who was pacing near the window, his eyes constantly scanning the street outside. Minutes passed. each one stretching longer than the last. Finally, Alex let out a quiet exclamation, drawing their attention. "Got it," he said, his voice triumphant. "I've got access to the full footage." He clicked a few keys, and the screen filled with a video feed from the previous night. They watched in silence as the events played out before them: Harper's patrol car arriving, Alice jogging in the park, the initial confrontation. Every detail was captured in stark clarity, including the moment Harper grabbed Alice and roughly cuffed her to the tree. "There it is," Alex said, pausing the video. "Clear evidence of unlawful detainment and excessive force. He had no reason to cuff her, no probable cause, nothing." Michael's fists clenched at his sides. "That's enough to take to internal affairs." "It should be," Alex agreed. "But we need more. Something that ties Harper to Renner, something that shows this wasn't just a one-time incident." "What about the audio?" Alice asked. "If there's sound, we might catch Harper making those threats he threw at me." Alex nodded and adjusted the settings. The video restarted, this time with sound. Harper's voice crackled through the speakers, each word dripping with condescension and barely veiled hostility. They listened as he made his threats, as he accused Alice of being a threat simply for existing in the park. "This is it," Alice said quietly. "This proves everything." Alex leaned back in his chair, a satisfied look on his face. "It's a good start. But we still need to move fast. Harper's not going to sit around and wait for us to expose him." Michael glanced at the window again, his instincts telling him that time was running out. "We need to get this to someone we can trust in internal affairs, someone who won't just sweep it under the rug." "I might know someone," Alex said. "A guy named Ramirez. He's been trying to clean up the department for years, but he's had a hard time getting any traction. This could be exactly what he needs." "Then we go to him," Michael said. "Today." Alex nodded, already pulling out his phone to make the call. As he did, Alice felt a flicker of hope for the first time since the ordeal had begun. They had a plan, they had evidence, and they had someone on the inside who might be willing to help. But even as that hope took root, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from over. Her instincts proved right a moment later when Michael's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at the screen, his eyes narrowing as he read the text. "What is it?" Alice asked, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "It's a warning," Michael said grimly. "Harper's looking for us. Word is, he's got a couple of guys with him, and they're not planning to talk." Alex swore under his breath. "We need to move. Now." Michael didn't hesitate. "Alice, stay close. Alex, grab the laptop and anything else we might need. We're not staying here." Within moments they were on the move, stepping out into the bright morning light. The city around them was waking up, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. As they made their way to Michael's car, Alice couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, half expecting Harper to appear around the corner with his goons in tow. They piled into the car, Bastian settling into the back seat with a quiet whine. Michael started the engine, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror as he pulled out onto the street. "Where's Ramirez?" he asked Alex. "Downtown," Alex replied. "If we take the back roads, we can get there without drawing too much attention." Michael nodded, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "Let's hope we're faster than Harper." As they drove, Alice tried to focus on the task at hand, but her mind kept drifting back to the events of the previous night. She thought about Harper's sneer, the way he had acted as though he was untouchable, as though he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. But now, for the first time, it felt like they had a real chance to fight back. They weren't out of danger yet, far from it. But they were closer than they had been before. And for Alice, that was enough to keep going. Because this time they weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, intimidated, or oppressed by people like Harper. And they weren't going to stop until justice was served. The drive to the downtown precinct felt longer than it should have. The city was waking up around them, but Alice barely noticed the morning commuters or the occasional honking of impatient drivers. Her mind was racing, thoughts tumbling over one another as she tried to anticipate Harper's next move. The tension in the car was thick, and the silence only amplified it. Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. He kept checking the rearview mirror, scanning for any sign that they were being followed. Alex sat in the passenger seat, his laptop open on his lap, typing furiously as he tried to maintain a secure line of communication with Ramirez, the internal affairs officer they were about to meet. Bastian lay quietly in the back seat, his eyes alert, sensing the unease in the air. "They'll try to block us," Michael said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a hard edge to it. "Harper and his people know we've got something. They won't just let us walk into the precinct and hand it over." "Let them try," Alex said without looking up from his screen. "We've got the footage, and we've got Ramirez. If we can get this to him before Harper makes a move, we've got a real shot at shutting this down." Alice leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "And if we don't?" Michael didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a sharp turn down a side street, keeping to the quieter roads to avoid any unnecessary attention. Finally, he said, "Then we improvise. But either way, we're not backing down." Alice felt a surge of determination. She had spent years fighting for others, standing up against injustice in courtrooms and community meetings. But this time it was personal. This time she was fighting for herself, for her brother, and for anyone who had ever been silenced by people like Harper. As they approached the precinct, Alex's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "Ramirez says he's ready, but he's getting pushback from higher-ups. Word's already spread that we're coming." "Figures," Michael muttered. "They're trying to shut him down before he can even talk to us." "We have to move fast," Alex said. "Once we're inside, we'll only have a small window before Harper's people try to interfere." Michael pulled the car into a side alley near the precinct, parking behind an unmarked service entrance. He turned off the engine and looked at Alice and Alex. "Stay close. No matter what happens, we stick together." They got out of the car, and Bastian hopped down beside Alice, his tail wagging slightly as if trying to reassure her. The air was cool, and the faint smell of exhaust lingered from nearby traffic. Michael led the way to the service door, knocking twice in a rhythmic pattern. A moment later it opened, and a man in a plain suit stepped out. "Ramirez," Michael said, nodding at him. "Michael." Alex Ramirez greeted them, his expression serious. "We don't have much time. Harper's people are already stirring things up, and Renner's trying to block the investigation before it even starts." "We have the evidence," Alex said, holding up a flash drive. "Footage from the park, with audio. It's enough to nail Harper and put a dent in Renner's operation." Ramirez took the drive and motioned for them to follow him inside. The narrow hallway was dimly lit, the air thick with tension. They moved quickly, keeping their voices low as they made their way to a small, windowless office. Once inside, Ramirez locked the door behind them and inserted the flash drive into his computer. As the footage played on the screen, Ramirez watched in silence, his expression growing grimmer by the second. When it ended, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. "This is bad," he said. "Harper's completely out of line here, and the threats he made. This is enough to open an investigation." "Can you do it without interference?" Michael asked. Ramirez hesitated. I can try, but Renner's got deep connections. He'll do everything he can to bury this before it gains traction. That's why we're here, Alex said. We don't just want Harper exposed. We want Renner out too. He's been protecting guys like Harper for too long. Ramirez nodded slowly. It won't be easy, but with this evidence, I can at least get the ball rolling. Once it's official, it'll be harder for them to cover it up. Then do it, Alice said firmly. We're not leaving until we know this is in motion. Ramirez gave her a small, approving nod. All right. I'll start the process, but you need to be careful. If Harper knows you're here, he might try something. We can handle Harper, Michael said. Just make sure this gets where it needs to go. Ramirez began typing, filing an official report and attaching the footage as evidence. The tension in the room was almost unbearable as they waited, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, Ramirez hit a key, and the screen flashed with a confirmation message. It's done, he said. The report is filed, and the evidence is secured. Internal Affairs will have to launch an investigation now. Alice felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was short-lived. A loud banging on the door made them all jump, and a familiar voice shouted from the other side. Open up. This is Officer Harper. Michael's eyes met Alice's, and she saw the same determination reflected in his gaze. Ramirez stood, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. Stay calm, Michael said quietly. They don't have the authority to do anything right now. We're in an official investigation. Harper banged on the door again, louder this time. Ramirez, you're making a mistake. Open this door, or we're coming in. Ramirez took a deep breath and stepped toward the door. Let me handle this. He unlocked the door and opened it just enough to see Harper's face, flushed with anger. Behind him stood two other officers, both looking uncomfortable but unwilling to disobey Harper's orders. What do you want? Harper, Ramirez asked, his tone cold. You know damn well what I want, Harper snapped. You think you can just waltz in here and start an investigation without consulting anyone? This is above your pay grade, Ramirez. Ramirez didn't flinch. I'm following procedure. If you have a problem with that, take it up with Internal Affairs. Harper's eyes flicked to the room behind Ramirez, landing on Michael and Alice. His jaw clenched, and for a moment it looked like he might try to force his way in. But then he seemed to reconsider, stepping back with a sneer. This isn't over, he said, pointing a finger at Michael. You think you've won? You have no idea who you're dealing with. Michael stepped forward, his expression calm but deadly serious. Neither do you. Harper stared at him for a long moment before finally turning and walking away, his officers following reluctantly. Ramirez closed the door and locked it again, letting out a relieved breath. That was close, he said. But it's done. They can't stop the investigation now. Alice leaned back against the wall, exhaustion finally catching up with her. They had won this round, but she knew the fight was far from over. Still, for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope. Michael placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a reassuring squeeze. We'll see this through, he said, no matter what it takes. And Alice believed him. Because if there was one thing she had learned, it was that when you stood together, even the toughest battles could be won. And this was a battle they intended to finish.